The United States Foreign Service is confronting one of its most profound crises in its long and proud history. At a time of pandemic and mounting global challenges, our nation's career diplomats find themselves without the support, funding, training, and leadership they need to represent the United States effectively overseas and in Washington, D.C. The United States needs a strong and high-performing foreign policy service to defend our country and advance its interests in the 21st century. Many of our most serious challenges the United States will face in 2022 and beyond will require our diplomats to take the lead. These include return of great power competition, leading a global response to the pandemic and its consequences, companies overseas, mounting a major effort on climate change, negotiating rebalancing of our focus from the Middle East to Asia, and helping American citizens in any corner of the world who need support from their government. Morale at the State Department is at an all-time low, and efforts to promote greater racial and ethnic diversity have failed just when the country needs women and men of all backgrounds as our primary link to nearly every country in the world. There are challenges to be met inside the Foreign Service as well, including an honest self-assessment of the service's internal culture, just as the United States succeeded in renewing both the military and intelligence agencies in recent decades. We must now do the same for our diplomats and our diplomacy. Ambassador Marc Grossman served as the Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs, the State Department's third-ranking official until his retirement in 2015, after 29 years in the U.S. Foreign Service. As Undersecretary, he helped to marshal diplomatic support for the international response to the terror attacks on September 11, 2001. He also managed U.S. policies in the Balkans and Colombia and promoted a key expansion of NATO alliance. As an Assistant Secretary for European Affairs, he helped direct NATO's military campaign in Kosovo and an earlier round of NATO expansion. In Turkey, Ambassador Grossman encouraged vibrant U.S.-Turkish political, military, and economic relations. And Ambassador Grossman was then recalled to the State Department in 2011 and 12 to serve as a special representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan. Many of our audience will recall that Ambassador Grossman addressed us in April of this year, the U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy. Welcome back to FBC. Ambassador Marci Reis is a private consultant specializing in relations with Europe and national security. She also mentors and speaks on leadership and diplomacy in new civilian and military leaders. During 37 years on diplomatic service, she served in Europe, the Middle East, and the Caribbean. She's a three-time chief of mission, United States ambassador to Albania, and most recently, United States ambassador to Bulgaria. Ambassador Reis has wide experience on European and security issues. She's been a principal deputy assistant secretary in both European and arms control bureaus. During the surge of 2007, 2008, she served as a political military minister at Embassy Baghdad and was a senior member of the team that negotiated the 2011 New START Treaty, which was signed in April of 2010. Welcome to Foreign Policy at Chappaqua, Marci. Mr. Ambassador, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. And first of all, thank you very much for having me back at Chappaqua on the Foreign Policy Group. It was a pleasure to be here in April. I think you were very wise to have chosen a topic, the Indo-Pacific strategy at that time. You can see how much has happened since. And so I'm very pleased to be back. And just let me thank you, Mal. Let me thank Joan, who I hope feels better, and all of those people who have worked so hard to make the technology work so well. And so we thank you very much for the opportunity to be here. Also, I just wanted to thank every single person who has signed on this morning to thank you for your interest in this topic. Because as you will see when Marci and I give our presentation this morning, it's very important that the public get behind the reform of the State Department, get behind the reform of the Foreign Service, so we can make some, not all perhaps, but some of the actions that we have recommended into reality. And again, I was here in April by myself. This time I'm delighted to be joined by Ambassador Marci Reis, who has a colleague and a co-author of this report and has become a great friend in this last couple of years as we have tried to work together to promote reform in the State Department and reform in the Foreign Service. Our plan this morning is I was just going to make a few introductory remarks, very much along the lines that Mal said, particularly on the things have changed, the world has changed. It's time for change in our diplomacy, in our Foreign Service, and in our State Department. Marci will talk a little bit about some of the actions that we have recommended in the Belfer report on a U.S. diplomatic service for the 21st century, and then I'll come back and make some concluding remarks. And we very, very much look forward to your questions and to your comments. I think the important thing here for us, when Marci and I and Ambassador Nick Burns, who was the other partner in all of this, and as you know, has been nominated by President Biden to be the U.S. ambassador to China, and he had his confirmation hearing last week, and so we hope he'll be on his way soon, but he obviously can no longer participate with us in this work. But when we started this effort, we started right where Mal started, which is that the world has changed. It's different. The way our diplomacy works has been effective in so many ways, but also needs to change. And that's our fundamental thought. And so the fact that you're having Anne-Marie Slaughter here in a couple of weeks is a good bookend and is a good part of this conversation. We've been on lots of programs with her. We don't agree with her about everything and that she's recommending with the State Department. I'm sure she doesn't agree with all the things that we are recommending, but it's right that people are rethinking the way that we are moving forward. And when I think back to the effect of COVID, not just on the programs like this, but the way that COVID accelerated economic, technological, social changes and trends, and some of them very positive, the pandemic also brought new thinking and ways of doing business to the practice of diplomacy. And it's never going back to the way it was. It's different. And the question is, can we take advantage of what's happened to really make change in the Foreign Service and at the State Department? I'm sure some of you have read and seen some of the books by Philip Sieb, who's, I think, a great thinker and on the impacts of media and diplomacy and change in the way that people do diplomacy. He's at the University of Southern California. And there's a great quote from him that in a book in 2016 that he wrote that traditionalists who believe that fast diplomacy is almost always bad diplomacy face a disconcerting reality. They must adapt to a strange and inhospitable world in which the interest of diverse publics must be addressed quickly, and deciding what to say may take precedence over what to do. And you can see that really emphasized during the pandemic. I was struck by an article, again, during the pandemic from The Economist, where they brought Phil's argument up to date by saying that diplomacy has gone viral. And it noted that, but there's a big challenge, right? Which is that building rapport is harder on Zoom than in person. And the really hard part of negotiation is best done in person. And so COVID-19 has hastened the arrival of hybrid diplomacy. And what Marci and I and Nick all came to believe was that the pandemic had also even further exposed the urgent need to change the way diplomacy is carried out, who is chosen to do this crucial task, and how they are made professionally ready to carry out the jobs that they are assigned. And I think it's worth repeating the notes that Mal gave you in his introduction, because I think that among the most serious challenges and the best opportunities that the United States will face in the future will require American diplomats not just to lead, but to be ready to lead. And that's one of the reasons that we are so committed to trying to push forward some of these changes in American diplomacy. And as he said, it's about the return to great power competition, but still paying attention to terrorism. It's about the continuing global response to the pandemic and getting ready for any in the future. He talked about supporting American companies as they compete abroad, and that's extremely important. And let's not forget also the point about protecting American citizens when they need the help of their government, a fundamental requirement for the U.S. Foreign Service and for U.S. diplomacy. So I don't know whether they considered it to be a plus or a minus, but the Biden administration came into power having received several studies recommending important changes in how America carries out its diplomacy. We had the good fortune to participate in one of them, which Marci will talk about. There was one from the Council on Foreign Relations and others as well. And I would say to you that the reports generally shared the premise that U.S. diplomacy, with its long and its proud history, and staffed today by a remarkable group of patriotic and committed and effective employees, just as Mal said, confronts a profound crisis, both from external attacks on its core functions and an internal culture that creates roadblocks to change and needs a brutally honest self-assessment. As Marci will tell you, we met with hundreds and hundreds of people during the year we put this study together. And in fact, it was one of the advantages of Zoom. And one of the things that they said was, you've got to take a look at yourselves. There has to be this brutal self-assessment. And so we thought, as retired Foreign Service people, we might have something small to offer as a way forward to support the people who are in the forefront of our diplomacy today. So as I say, the Biden administration had these reports to work on. One of ours was the one we had the privilege to work on. And so I just asked Marci to now take over and talk to you a little bit about the report and some of the recommendations.
Thanks, Marc, for that kind introduction, and thank you everyone for having me with you today. It's a real pleasure. I'm sorry I can't visit in person. I've never been to Chappaqua, but maybe someday. About our report, I'd like to reemphasize that what we felt as a reason to start on this was that there really was a very serious crisis in the Foreign Service and in the operation of the State Department, that this sort of jewel of the in the crown of the American government wasn't being utilized to its full capacity, and especially the people, because after all, diplomacy is about people, was not being mobilized at the very moment efficiently, at the very moment when it was most needed. And that there was really a desire and a need for thoroughgoing change. Not so many years ago, in the ratings that are done every year of the most desirable places to work in Washington, the State Department was ranked very near the top. And that is actually no longer the case. The number of people applying to take the examination has gone down. We started losing people at the mid-level, which is not good at all. It was well recognized that there's a serious morale problem, but also we felt that the mission and mandate of the Foreign Service and of the State Department was somehow muddied. There wasn't the kind of definition that we really need. What exactly does the State Department do for us, for the United States, for the American people? So lacking the leadership and the resources, frankly, that were needed for effective foreign policy, we thought that it was time to think really deeply about what to do about the Foreign Service. And interestingly, this has been done previously for the military, which resulted in the Goldwater-Nichols legislation, which really changed things quite a bit. And the same thing has been done for the intelligence community. But what about the State Department? Well, the last time legislation, really thoroughgoing legislation, was done was actually 40 years ago, 1980, Foreign Service Act of 1980. So we thought, well, okay, it's probably time for a really big, deep examination of the State Department. Our report has a spotlight on 10 actions that we think ought to be taken in order to revise and revitalize the Foreign Service and and make it the valuable tool that the United States needs right now when their focus is really a lot less on military activities, as we all know, and a lot more on diplomacy. I won't talk about all of them, but I do want to focus on 3 or 4. One is the mission and mandate. What is it that the State Department and the Foreign Service does for us, for the United States? That needs to be clearly defined. It needs to be clearly defined from the top, by the president, by the Congress, so that we know that it is the State Department and the Foreign Service which are the primary implementers of United States foreign policy. And we need also to make very clear what the position is of the United States ambassadors. Because today we have abroad, and our embassies abroad, some of our embassies have as many as 20 different or more US agencies represented, and the ambassador should be the primo inter pares, but sometimes that is not universally recognized. So we decided that at the very top, what needs to happen is that the mission and mandate of the service and of our ambassadors needs to be well defined. We also thought that professionalization of the State Department, how our people are educated and how they are supported throughout their career in terms of the professionalization, was very, very important. We looked at, frankly, at what other countries do, peer services, the Chinese, the French, the British, and they give their people a lot more education, a lot more continuing education than we have. In fact, we've always relied on the sort of learn by doing. Our people are so strong when they come to us, we think, that they could just kind of learn as they go along, and whatever situation you put them in, they'd figure it out. Well, the world is much too complicated today for that, and there are many areas of very specialized knowledge that we really need for. And as Marc has mentioned, communication is a very important part of the role of our embassies and of our ambassadors. Most of our ambassadors have Facebook pages, they tweet, and they need to have those capabilities, but they also need to have, excuse me, they also need leadership and management skills and so on. And one of the things that has happened to our service over the years, and I want to start out by saying that I am not against some of our ambassadors being chosen from the political world or from academia or whatever. We've had some extremely successful politically chosen ambassadors, and there are countries that are very used to that, and in fact like it, because they feel that their ambassador can pick up the phone and call the President of the United States. But what we have had happen is that we have political appointments deeper and deeper into the Foreign Service. And what does that mean? That means that our people, as they are growing up in the Foreign Service, don't have a perspective of being in management, or a perspective, as Marc did, of becoming the highest level political person in the State Department. And they need to have that, or they won't advance, and they won't acquire the skills that we need them to have. So professionalization, we thought, was very important. We need a personnel system that is more flexible, that can deal with 21st century personnel issues. When I came in the Foreign Service, I came in together with my husband. This was extremely unusual at the time, but it's not unusual now. And plus, we have lots of Foreign Service officers who have partners who have their own professions. So what we need is a much more flexible personnel system that will allow people to take off, for example, for a number of years, or go off and earn a PhD, or work in the private sector and bring back the skills that they learn into the Foreign Service. So we proposed a lot of changes in the area of personnel. And finally, I want to mention, and comes a little bit from my own experience. As Mal mentioned, I went to Baghdad in 2007, which was known as the Surge. And perhaps not everyone knows that in addition to a military surge, we had a civilian surge. But that proved to be pretty hard to do for this. The State Department had to really stretch itself to put all those people into Baghdad at the time. And one of the things we learned from that was that we really need a much more official surge capacity. And in our minds, one way to do that would be to have a reserve corps, just like the military has. Well, not just like, but patterned somewhat on what they do, which means that we would have people who gave service on a regular basis and who brought their backgrounds, perhaps retired Foreign Service, but maybe not, or retired military, or just ordinary citizens who wanted to sign up for service to their country. And we also thought that maybe it would work the other way. That is to say that if we had reserve officers in communities around the United States, then those communities would know a lot more about us as a service. So I won't go into all the rest of the things that we proposed, but basically the State Department and the Foreign Service needs modernization, needs more resources, needs more attention to its role, and all of those. And lastly, I think I'll mention, because it's almost understood now, but the topic that we heard most often about was diversity and inclusion. And a lot of our recommendations take account of that. Frankly, since I left the Foreign Service 6 years ago, but in the 37 years that I was there, practically from the first, we had programs to try and increase diversity and inclusion in the Foreign Service, and frankly, they did not succeed. Things were not particularly better by the time I left than from the time I started. So we need a much more serious focus on this. In the diverse world in which we serve, there are huge advantages to having a Foreign Service that is diverse, brings many languages and different backgrounds, and also the service should be representative of the United States. So in that area, we added a lot of suggestions about how things could be improved today. And I think I'll stop there and give it back to Marc.
Marci, thank you very much. Let me just follow up a couple of points that Marci made. One of the things that she emphasized was this question of making sure that the American public, the people of the United States of America, know that the State Department, the Foreign Service, is there to serve it. And that was one of the themes that ran through our recommendations. One of our last actions, and this was actually an idea of Marci's, was to change the name. We grew up as Foreign Service officers, and we felt it was time to change the name to the U.S. Diplomatic Service so that people understand that it's about the United States, it's about service, and it's about diplomacy. And I think that was a very important theme. A couple of other points that I would make on the report. One of them is that just to say that if you look into the past, as Marci said, a lot of people have thought about these things, but a number of secretaries of state did something about it. And we built on their efforts. And two, I would say, one, because he's really very much in our minds these past few days, is Colin Powell. And when Colin Powell was Secretary of State, he recognized, because he had lived his life as a military officer and a military leader, that he had recognized exactly the points that Marci made about the need for professional education, the need for people to go back and hone their skills. And he gave us, at the time, what was called a float for training and transit, 15% of the then Foreign Service, which of course was immediately all scooped up in Afghanistan and Baghdad. And so we built on the ideas that Colin Powell gave us at that time. And as I say, I've been thinking a lot about him and his influence on this report. And of course, your neighbor, Mrs. Clinton, Secretary Clinton, was kind enough to meet with us as we put this report together. She followed Colin Powell's ideas and continued to increase the number of people at the State Department, Foreign Service, and Civil Service. Or your neighbor there, your close neighbor, Mrs. Clinton, gave us a lot of advice and input into this report as well. I'd also say that this is not a question that is new in terms of the last few administrations. These are challenges that have existed for a while, and Secretary Pompeo recognized the need to make some changes as well. He started hiring new Foreign Service people again. He hired family members again. So that was very important. And as both Marci and I have seen, there are some good signs out there today. The Biden administration has come, and Secretary Blinken has testified in front of the Congress, seeking more money for the State Department, an increase in personnel. He has focused on this question of diversity, equity, and inclusion. One of the recommendations of our report was that there be a chief diversity officer appointed at the State Department, and that's been done. And she's been given some very important powers. And also, and very much thanks to Marci, because she's done most of the testimony, there's a lot of interest in the Congress in these areas, and particularly in the interest of professional education, language training, diversity, and the Diplomatic Reserve Corps. One thing that we are eagerly awaiting, and I hope you will be too, is on Wednesday, Secretary Blinken, it's been announced this morning, is going to make some remarks at the Foreign Service Institute on the modernization of American diplomacy. And so we look forward to that and hope that some of our ideas might find our way into their thinking as well. Two final points from me. One is I wanted to give you a sense of kind of the money involved here, because I think as taxpayers, we all should make sure that we're thinking about kind of what this all costs. And so if you think about the additions we'd like to make to the Foreign Service, a 15% float would be about 2,000 people today, would be in the neighborhood over a period of years, kind of in the hundreds of millions of dollars. We've recommended another 1,400 to 1,800 people over 4 years, probably again in the $500 million range. And the Diplomatic Reserve Corps, we have recommended 250 people get hired a year over 4 years. And our budget estimates there are 20 million in the first year, 25 in the second, 30, and then $35 million a year going out. And I know that seems, I think, like a lot of money. Sometimes it does to me, certainly. But compared to the larger budget and what's happening in the military and the intelligence services, we think it's very much worthwhile. One final point for me on next steps. As you can imagine, my administration, many things to do, very important things to get settled. But Marci and I, again, with Nick moving on to be the ambassador to China, I hope if he's confirmed by the Senate, we're committed to continuing this effort. And so with the help of the wonderful Una Chapman Cox Foundation, who financed the first report along with several other people, they have offered to us the opportunity to make a presentation to them to take this now into the future. And Harvard University, which was the home base of our report while Ambassador Burns was there, has stepped aside, and we hope to sign up Arizona State University to be the new host for our effort. And so what we hope to do is continue this conversation, continue it with the administration, continue it with the Congress, continue it with the people who are serving today, and very much continue it with the public. And that's why we so much appreciate the opportunity to be here with you. I'll finish with this. I was getting ready for this presentation, and I went back to David McCullough's wonderful, wonderful biography of John Adams. And you'll find in there a wonderful section where Adams is assigned, as you will recall, to be America's first minister. We didn't even call them ambassadors at the time. He was the first minister to England after the Revolution. And he was criticized very stringently by a loyalist who had fled to London. And here's what this person had to say about John Adams. He says, John Adams is not qualified by nature or education to be a diplomat. His abilities are undoubtedly equal to the mechanical parts of his business as ambassador, but that's not enough. He cannot dance, he cannot drink, he cannot gamble, flatter, promise, dress, swear with the gentleman, small talk, make small talk, and flirt with the ladies. In short, he has none of the essential arts or ornaments which constitute a diplomat. And so one of the things that I always say in rereading that is that that was never my job description. It wasn't Ambassador Reis's job description, and it's not the job description of the people who represent the United States around the world today. As Marci said, we're interested in making sure that there's a diplomacy that's strong for the future. And when young people ask me, and I'm sure when Marci gets the same question, if they should become diplomats and represent the United States of America, my answer is always yes, because we're going to need professional and creative and courageous diplomats to represent the values and the diversity and the strength of the United States to promote our country's interests and values for years to come. And of course, as you all know, those who answer the call to service today are going to do so in an increasingly dangerous world, in a world, as Mal said, that has changed and where many of our fundamental values are being attacked. And there are these new dispersed ways to communicate. And they're only going to succeed if they strengthen and adapt their practices, their procedures, their culture, their institutions to this new world. And so Marci and I hope that we can make some modest contribution to the effort to see that that happens, and we hope that you will as well. So Mal and Joan, we thank you very much for the opportunity to make this presentation this morning, and we look forward to questions and comments.
Thank you. And that's really a good high-level outline of the work you've done. But I'd like to ask you to go a little deeper, to dive just a little deeper. And I'll take one area that I discovered as I read the report. By the way, the report is available. Anyone who wants it can get a hold of it. It's not easy reading. It's not brief reading, but it is quite important because some of the details are ones in which I think would make clearer some of the questions, for example, like education. One of the quotes in the report really comes from Colin Powell, and he said essentially, in the 30 some odd years that I was in the government service, 7 of those years I spent in education, in training myself and improving myself and doing other kinds of things that let me be who I became. Now, it's not in the report, but I did hear another webinar by another organization in which Richard Haas said, I spoke to Ambassador Marc Grossman, and I asked him, how much training did you have? And apparently the answer was a few weeks in the course of 30 some odd years. That's a very substantial difference in approach. This is not just technical stuff. This is not just detailed stuff. This is a very fundamental, and I wish you guys would talk about it because it's been a very important part of different services, different departments. If I might just add one more piece, we all know how terrific General Petraeus was. Well, General Petraeus took a period of time, went off, got his PhD, and came back to head an important project in Iraq. And I suspect that a lot of what he learned, not technical stuff, not administrative stuff, but thinking about, gave him an opportunity to operate in a different way than he would have done or that his colleagues had done for a long time. Would you talk about some of the places where going a little bit deeper where those really come to play?
Mel, I'd be glad to. Marci, just let me start, and then I'll turn it over to you. And I start because this quotation from Colin Powell, of course, is a really important one. And Richard actually had heard Colin Powell, and I do this in person. Secretary Powell and I he used to bring me to events, and he'd say, "So, Marc, you're a senior foreign service officer. I had all these years. How many?" I'd say, "Well, I had, a few weeks." And we tried to make this personal and show that somebody allowed me to get to be very senior at the State Department without having had very much professional education. I'd also say the other thing that we learned from Powell, from Secretary Powell, was that he never failed. He called it professional education. That's what it was, professional education and training. And I think that's a very important thing. I'd say, Mel, three points, and then I give this over to Marci. One is that what we tried to do in the report was to say that the only way to deal with this question is to deal with it systematically and to deal with it in terms of responsibility. To say to people, if you have periods in your career, you're an incoming officer, you're a middle grade officer, you're a senior officer, actually, you shouldn't be able to go from one group to another unless you've had some professional education, unless you've taken the time to stop and to educate yourself. Right now, as Marci said in her presentation, this is, learn by doing, or, you'll figure it out. And the world doesn't work that way anymore. And we need to do this differently. Second thing, I think, coming through the report, and I hope it does anyway, is that part of the responsibility here belongs to the State Department itself. At the moment, professional education is not considered part of the culture of the State Department. It's something that you're forced to do. It's something that someone tells you to do. And one of the things we learned from our military and intelligence colleagues is, unless, as we've said before, you take a deep, deep, honest look at your own culture, that none of this stuff is going to work. And so we emphasized in the report, as you saw, that particularly when it comes to professional education, that the culture has to change and that the culture has to value this professional education. And third, one of the reasons that we started this set of recommendations with a personnel recommendation is you can't do this without increasing the State Department by 15%. Every military unit that Secretary Powell ever commanded had 15% float for training and transit. And that has how it has to be at the State Department. And our military colleagues told us that you got to get it into the law so that those people can't be used for anything else. And so, as I said, for us, 15% float today would be about 2,000 people. We recommended it take place over 3 years. And that's the foundation of all of the recommendations on personnel. And so, Marci, I'd ask for your views.
Well, thanks, Marc. I think you've pretty much covered it. I want to pick up on one thing that Mal said about his mention of General Petraeus, because I worked very closely with him and with our Ambassador Crocker when I was when we were all together in Baghdad. And I have to say that it was so noticeable that he had that background. He has a PhD from Princeton in foreign policy, and it made it so much easier for all of us to work together to really make a surge, to really transform things there in Iraq, because we all understood that there was more than military tactics that needed to be considered in terms of what we were doing. And one of the things that we thought about when we thought about education was that what was missing. We have a wonderful establishment, the Foreign Service Institute in Arlington, Virginia, which teaches all of the world's languages and gives training now to our Foreign Service officers. I don't want to imply that that's missing, but the focus is really on preparing people for specific jobs. And there is a leadership and management school. We've introduced leadership and management training. But what needs to be added is much more of a focus on strategic thinking, on current challenges in foreign policy, on the kind of reflection and thought that our foreign service officers need the opportunity to think deeply about these things, not just once at the beginning of their careers, but over time. We now have a lessons learned capacity at the Institute, and that needs to be woven into this into this education and training. The way the military has what they call a hot wash, we need to think about events and what worked and what didn't work. We need to have the capacity to go into more depth. So I had actually the advantage of taking a course that lasted, it no longer existed, that lasted 9 months and included members from all the military services and from all the cabinet departments that contribute to foreign policy, and there were a lot of them. And the result of that was that for all of us, and we've stayed in touch now for 20 years, for all of us, we had a much better understanding of all of those cabinet departments and what they did. And so when we became ambassadors, we had a much better sense of what it was to run a country team that is composed of representatives from all over the US government. And in my case, for a lot of people from the military as well. So I think it's really very important that we think deeply about professional training, and we give our officers the best. If we're going to have the best diplomatic service in the world, then we need to have the best professional training.
Now, if I could just add one sentence, and that is that also in the report, I think very important to emphasize, is that we also recognize that it would be great if there was a diversity in where people took that training. So not just with all due respect to Harvard, to Yale, to Princeton, to Georgetown, but to get people out and to do that training around the country. One, because they would be exposed to different views. And two, again, all through the report, we're looking for ways to get the Foreign Service reconnected to the American people.
Yeah.
One of the things you talked about a little earlier was the fact that Nick Burns is currently being considered by the Congress, by the Senate, for a post of ambassador to China. And so one of the first questions that arose this morning, almost before you got well into was the question of how come it takes so long and so hard to get ambassadors and other senior people into positions of responsibility? The author says we're missing ambassadors to our allies, England, France, Germany, and Japan, as well as our adversaries such as China. What's going on here? Is this simply a political football? What is this? That is so important, but can't get it done?
Well, I would say that first of all, it's a great question and very pertinent. If you look out there, I believe it's right that only one ambassador appointed by the Biden administration, Ambassador Salazar in Mexico, has actually got through the whole system and is in place. Every other ambassador, both career and non-career, are still waiting, and it's a shame. It does argue, I think, for the point that Marci made. One of the recommendations, the actions in our report was less political appointees, not zero, but less. I think the challenge today, Malin, to your very important questioner, is that the Biden administration now, I think, took a substantial amount of time in getting people nominated. It's now a very bureaucratic and challenging system. But secondly, as you all know from the news, Senator Cruz of Texas, who's very opposed to the administration's position on Nord Stream 2, which is a Russian gas pipeline, which runs from Russia now to Germany. And he's opposed to the administration's position on this pipeline. And he's been very clear and very open and very honest that he's going to hold up all these appointees until the Biden administration does something different about the pipeline. And so that's sort of way beyond, Marci and my pay grade here. But Senator Cruz, it's not a secret. He's held up all of these people because he thinks that the Biden administration has made the wrong decision on this pipeline.
Kind of important, though.
Well, I mean, we both recognize our bias. We think that the United States of America should have ambassadors around the world, be they career or non-career. And just as your questioner said, some of the most important posts, allies, friends, adversaries, still open.
Another piece that I think you may have downplayed a tiny bit is the question of political appointees. Now, Marci did say we've had some really terrific political appointees, some really notable ones. But on the other hand, we've had really population of many key posts, not only ambassadorial, but administrative posts that go to people with political orientation, but maybe not the kind of backgrounds that make a difference. Is it really possible to change that, or is this just the way of the current world? You give me $1 million for my campaign, you get to be the ambassador to something or other, or you get to be the deputy something or other to something or other. Is that the world we're in?
Marci, would you like to start on that? Or?
Yeah, no, I don't. I don't think that's the world we're in, actually. Well, I think where we came out was that there is a role for political appointees, but the number of them is something we'd like to see adjusted. Over time, there's been roughly a split of 30% political appointees and about 70% professionals. And that's been pretty consistent over various administrations. And we actually came down on a split that was 10-90, but if you think about it, there are 189 ambassadorships, and so 10% would be something like 19, which certainly leaves room for a lot of the big and important embassies. But I think that the question of who becomes an ambassador should have to do with qualifications. What do they bring to the table? How are they really going to represent the United States of America? What qualities, background, professional qualifications do they have? So I think these decisions should be based on that, on expertise and qualifications for the job, not on how well they dance or whether they know how to drink or other extraneous characteristics. And last, I want to leave with this point, which is this gets back to the very point of what it takes to be a diplomat and what is the role of our diplomacy. It is not just giving parties. Our ability to speak to the important people in a country, the people who are making the decisions, the leaders, and to convince them to support whatever position it is of the United States, or to go along with activities that we think are important. That's the role of diplomacy. It's the art of persuasion. So the question is, what qualifications do these people have to serve in that role? And I think that ought to be at the bottom of it. It is written into the Foreign Service Act, but not often. There's very seldom a reference to that portion of the act.
Mal, I would say also, if you'd allow me, no disrespect, but I don't, in the report, we didn't underplay this at all. It's one of the 10 recommendations. And in fact, you'll see there, just as Marci said, we recommended that we shrink the number of political appointees as ambassadors to 10% by 2025, that we commit to 75% of assistant secretary level positions at the State Department, 75% by 2025, that we commit to the Undersecretary for Political Affairs and one other undersecretary should be career people, foreign service or civil service. And that, just as Marci said, that piece of the 1980 Foreign Service Act, which explicitly lists the qualifications for ambassadors, ought to be saved in any new legislation. So this is a really important point. I'd also say that we own this honesty too. Not every career person who's been appointed an ambassador, was maybe perfect either. And so Marci's point about qualifications is a really important one. And her point about mission and mandate, that's why we started there. What's the job? And once you know what the job is, then you can figure out what kind of people you need to do that job. So we were very, very explicit in numbers. I would say that, like, there are many of the recommendations that weren't so wildly accepted. And certainly when we made that proposition to, people at the White House, political people in the Congress, they said, "Are you crazy?" And we said, "No, we're not crazy. We're just trying to make a point to you here that 40% is too high and 10% is the right number." And that's what we're going to continue to fight for.
One of the points you made in the presentation was that in getting education to our professionals is important, that in spreading that education out, not just to the major schools, but around the country, really gives exposure. But Joyce Leonard asked the question even a little bit further. Essentially, is that enough? And the reason I ask that is that in the competition for resources, the competition for role and responsibility, okay, a lot of other things are at play. For example, one of the things you're competing with in the military is that in every parade, there's a military component. There's an Air Force or Navy set of flyers going over there. They've got an awful lot of stuff. They wear wonderful uniforms and they're covered with stuff. And you guys have a nice suit on, a nice tie, all the rest. How do you get that word out to people about the service, about the role of the service, about the needs of the service, about the needs of the people? Somehow, I think Joyce's question leads to the question, how do you get that word out on a consistent basis?
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. And Joyce, thank you for asking the question. As we said in the report, and we will both say to you today, the fact that we have not done so is on us. I mean, if you look at the report, it's one of the things that we say, among the things that the State Department has not done very well at all, including, as Marci mentioned, diversity and many other things, is making this case to the American people. And that's exactly why, again, an idea of Marci's, we wanted to change the name. So I don't want to go back to wearing a uniform like they did back in the old days. No, thank you. And we're not going to have airplanes and probably not in parades. But we could do some very important things. And I would start, as Marci would as well, with this question of changing the name. But the other thing that you pointed out, Mel, and I think from Joyce's question, is that's right. We said send people out to various parts of the country for their education. And you said, is that enough? Not nearly enough. And that's why in our report, you will see a major effort on the Diplomatic Reserve Corps chapter is what? Exactly as Marci said, that if there was a Diplomatic Reserve Corps, there would be reservists in cities and towns all over the United States. And after their service with the State Department, they'd come home and they'd say, gosh, these people at the State Department do an important job. They're patriotic people. They're hardworking people. They're working for the American people. So a big part of the Diplomatic Reserve Corps is a way to get this out. You'll also see in the report, one of the things that was recommended to us by our military colleagues was an ROTC-like activity, mostly to increase chances of diversity, but again, to get the word out into communities all around the nation about what it is that the Foreign Service, what it is that the State Department does. And so we recognize we're not going to compete with flyovers over major sporting events, but there's much more that can be done. And we embedded into many of our recommendations, education, the Reserve Corps, ROTC, that kind of thinking.
Pete Russell asked a question really about the interagency activities and the decision-making and the role that you play. And everybody wants to be the leader. Everybody wants to be the thought leader, the action leader. How does that role work today, and how would it work under your process?
Well, if I could start off on that one, Let's start with abroad, because that's the most important aspect of the Foreign Service. We operate through what's called a country team abroad. The ambassador is the chair, and the other agencies that are present in the embassy sit on the country team. And that in most places, the country team meets several times a week, if not every day. And the major decisions and the direction is set for the embassy in the country team. So each of those agencies has a say, but at the end of the day, it is the ambassador who leads and decides. And that is the way interagency decision-making happens abroad. Activities may involve, more and more these days, are various activities are conducted by task forces that have several members on them of the country team. So, for example, if there's a drug problem in that country, you might have somebody from DEA and somebody from our own security service, and maybe even somebody from the FBI, a legal attaché, who all work together to attack that problem. So that's how it happens abroad. Back in the United States, we have the National Security Council system, in which the National Security Council is the convener of the interagency to make foreign policy decisions. And the State Department plays an important role in those deliberations and contributes to the setting of foreign policy. So in our report, especially in the area where we talked about mission and mandate, we talked about how it was very important to underscore the State Department's role in those deliberations in Washington. Also, the department's role as the leader for implementation of foreign policy through the executive direction of our ambassadors. So that was, as Marc came back to this before, that coming back to mission and mandate, the essential point of what the role is of the State Department is something that has gotten kind of clouded and is unclear to people. And that's why it needs to be reiterated, and reiterated strongly from the top.
May I also just add, Pete, your very important point that sort of everybody wants to lead, everybody wants to be in the front. One of the things that, again, runs through our report, and I hope if you have a chance to read it, you'll find this to be true, is part of this is a culture question inside the State Department. And what we said in our report was, we want the State Department to be the best it can be, but to come back to a leadership role in the interagency, the State Department has to earn that. And the State Department and the Foreign Service has to earn it back. And so all of the recommendations that we made are designed to strengthen the institution and to strengthen the people so that they can earn this place back in the conversation. It isn't going to be given to us. And the report says this is not about giving the State Department something. The State Department has to earn this back. And the way they earn it is exactly as Marci said, with having the best ideas and the best execution. There are, fixes and technical ways to think about this, but mostly what we said was the mission and mandate, the State Department should be a leader, but it has to earn its way back to that leadership.
One of the questions comes from a long-term member of our group who really observes that over the decades, there's been a growing belief, not only in the government, but in a lot of other circles, that military first. The first answer is some form of military. The first answer is to more investment in some kind of a military. Even over the last week or so, a well-known former national security advisor said, we need more money. There's a strong long-term bias in terms of action. And action means, to many people, military action. How do you get around that? I understand you're dealing at the level of the department, but how do you get around that fundamental bias in the body politic?
Marci, you want to start? Or?
No, go ahead.
Well, first of all, obviously a big question and not recent. I mean, this is a question that's, I think, all the time we were in the State Department and clearly afterwards. I'd say that the fulcrum here, the issue is action. And that is, Malin, your questioner says, so action equals military. And I think one of the failures of the State Department and the Foreign Service over these years has been to convince people that diplomacy is action, that diplomacy is not just about, as Marci said, talking and going here and going there, but that it's producing things. It's helping American companies. It's making sure that American citizens are protected. And again, I know people will have their own views of this, and this is this, you can debate this, and it wasn't beautiful, but my goodness gracious, out of Afghanistan in 8 days, they took 126,000 human beings. And so that's an enormous accomplishment. That's about action. And I think the State Department, one of the ways to change this debate is to make diplomacy about action. And you'll see that running through our report. Again, it's the reason for a name change. It's the reason for mission and mandate. It will never be able to compete 100%. I'm not naive. And for all the reasons that you said in the previous question, that the military has an enormous impact on our country. And let me just say, as a diplomat, I'm for a strong defense, right? Strong diplomacy is based on having a strong military capacity. But diplomats need to stand up for themselves more and say, we're actors too. And it shouldn't be. I have a poster in my office, which I had made when I was the Director General of the Foreign Service. It says, diplomacy is America's first line of defense. And you have to believe that, and you have to act like it's true.
Yeah. Well, if I could just add, it also depends on the challenges that are facing our country. In the post 9/11 world, we understood that our first concern was the nation's security, and that translated into military action. And as Marc has pointed out, action is the thing that really consumes people. But now we're dealing with things like pandemic and climate change and cyber and all of those things, and those aren't susceptible to military action. They are susceptible to diplomatic action. And you can already see that there's a lot more interest in diplomacy around the world. And I think there's going to be a lot more focus on what we're doing at the United Nations, for example. We're going to, the Glasgow meeting on climate change. These are things that Americans care about, and they can, and dealing with these problems is a task for diplomacy.
I would say, if you think back to the conversation we all had in April, the Indo-Pacific strategy. So the Indo-Pacific strategy is great, but it isn't only a military strategy, and will fail if it's only a military strategy, because there's diplomacy involved, there's economic diplomacy, political. So if you think back to that conversation, it's a perfect example of where action is larger than military action.
And yet we don't hear much about it.
Well, part of that is the responsibility of the department. And part of it is, we're very glad to be here today to kind of try to change that.
As you guys went through this, you and Nick and Marci went through this, and your colleagues, you had a lot of background. You had a lot of stuff that you already knew. But what surprised you? Is there something that came out and said, I didn't know that. I didn't focus on that. This is really unique to me. What was new to you?
You know what? I think about this sometimes. I never thought that my profession would be dangerous. When I joined the Foreign Service, our hostages were taken in Iran just after I joined. That's how old I am. And I never thought that I would face situations which were actually, in some respect, physically dangerous. And I think the other thing that I didn't really think about was how broad my knowledge would have to be in order to really succeed in this profession. my background is actually, my academic background is East Asian politics. Okay, I've never served in East Asia at all in 37 years, but I certainly learned a lot about Europe and the Balkans, about the Middle East, and actually initially about the Caribbean. So the breadth and scope of the things that we do and we are asked to do is much broader than I really anticipated. And in one sense, it's thrilling. This is I would not trade this profession for anything else in the world. I feel just immensely privileged to have been able to serve my country and to do the things that I've done and see the things that I've seen. But honestly, I never anticipated what actually came to pass.
Now, I would say my answer during my career was very much along the line of Marci's, and like her, I wouldn't change it for anything. And one of the greatest privilege of my life was to work in an office where the American flag flies. I would say, if I could, just to answer your question about the report, and Marci gave you the broad answer. I learned two things in the report, in doing this report. I learned, number one, as Marci said in her presentation, every single group, and we met with 40 groups of people, everybody was focused on diversity. Everybody was focused on the State Department has to do a better job of representing the United States and representing itself. And the thing I learned was that if you just talk about diversity, it's not enough. That what we learned from what are called the affinity groups, the various groups at the State Department who represent various groups of people, African Americans, Hispanic Americans, all different kinds of people, they said it's about inclusion, that you can invite us to the party, but we then have to participate. And I must say, and you can consider this a fault of mine and shame on me, that I'd figured out the diversity part, but I hadn't understood the emphasis on the inclusion piece of it. And so you'll see in our report, we tried to learn that lesson. And it isn't just about getting people into the State Department, it's then about including them in making the department go forward. So we learned a lot in this couple of years that we worked on this. But for me, that was the thing I learned the most.
This is an incredible undertaking which you all have started off and continue to work on. But you also know that there are usually 3 or 4 really critical areas where you have to do well to make it happen. Critical success factors. What can you see are the critical success factors of this report and all the work you're doing to make it happen, to make it more than just another academic exercise?
Well, one of the things that we've seen is that there is interest in the Foreign Service and in the Congress. Not too many weeks ago, I testified in front of a subcommittee of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and they are planning a series of hearings on the State Department and on the Foreign Service, which is really great. It's really encouraging. And we also heard interest on the House side and most importantly, on both sides politically. And of course, to have change, that's just absolutely essential. It has to be nonpartisan. The diplomatic service belongs to all the American people, and so any changes that we have certainly have to be supported by both political parties.
I'd say, Mel, for me, and this is the next step that Marci and I are taking as we make this proposition to the various foundations and others who I hope will help us, is I think that the critical question for us is now, of the 10 recommendations, kind of which are the ones, which can we really get accomplished? And as I said, not all of them were wildly praised by people. You know, some people liked some people liked another. But we need now to focus on 3 or 4 that we think we could actually turn into either regulation or legislation. That's the first thing. So that's the first critical choice that needs to be made. And then secondly, I also think we are going to continue to need the support of our larger community, the larger Foreign Service State Department community, and very much, as Marci said, the Congress. I think that the Congress will play a very important role if we can get them interested, and they're already interested, and happily on a bipartisan basis. And then finally, we'll see here. I hope Secretary Blinken will give this effort a push in his speech to the Foreign Service Institute on Wednesday, and I hope you'll all keep your eye out for it.
Marci, Marc, many, many thanks for a terrific morning here at the Foreign Policy at Chappaqua. Appreciate your time, I appreciate your thinking, I appreciate what the work you've been doing. I also want to thank Joan Kuhn, the members of the library staff, Carrie Krams, who makes all this technology happen, for making this project of ours work as well as it does. I also want to thank all of you who participated. From wherever you are, please stay safe. Please stay. In 2 weeks, we are going to have another program. The topic is the strategies of connection and leadership in a networked world. What I think is a bookend to this terrific program this morning. Thank you all. Be safe, be well. Look forward to seeing you again in the near future.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you.